World War II. The Good War. A global conflict that pitted the free world against the evils of fascism. The narrative is clean, heroic, and widely accepted. The Allies fought a just war, defeating Hitler and liberating Europe from tyranny. But that's only half the story. Behind the triumph of Allied forces lies a darker, more complex reality. One that includes mass bombings of civilian populations, forced labor, ethnic cleansing, and internment of innocent people. These are the stories you don't often hear, the atrocities committed by the so-called good guys. Let's talk about them. In February 1945, the German city of Dresden was obliterated in a series of firebombing raids by the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. Dresden wasn't a major military target. It had little to no strategic value. It was, at that point in the war, a city filled mostly with refugees, civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet army. But on the night of February 13th, the Allies launched a relentless bombing campaign. Over 3,900 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs rained down, creating a firestorm so intense it melted asphalt and sucked the oxygen out of the air. Tens of thousands, estimates range from 25,000 to 35,000, were killed. Entire families incinerated. Bodies burned beyond recognition. Survivors spoke of people literally fused to the pavement or suffocating in underground shelters. Winston Churchill himself, just weeks later, wrote in a memo, "The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing." He knew. What happened in Dresden was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of terror bombing, a strategy designed not just to destroy infrastructure, but to break the will of the German people. To kill, en masse. And Dresden wasn't the only one. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and dozens of other cities faced similar fates. When Germany bombed London, it was called the Blitz. When the Allies did it on a far more devastating scale, it was called liberation. When we picture the Soviets during World War II, we often remember them as the unstoppable force that broke the Nazi war machine at the Eastern Front. And while their sacrifice was enormous, so were their crimes. As the Red Army pushed westward through Eastern Europe, stories of rape, looting, and mass executions became widespread. In Germany, Poland, Hungary, and beyond, Soviet soldiers committed acts so horrific they rivaled the Nazis in brutality. Perhaps the most infamous of these is the Katyn massacre. In 1940, over 22,000 Polish military officers, intellectuals, and leaders were executed by the Soviet NKVD in the Katyn forest and other locations. Shot in the back of the head, dumped into mass graves. A systematic purge designed to wipe out Poland's leadership. For decades, the Soviets blamed the massacre on the Nazis. Western allies went along with it. It wasn't until 1990, 50 years later, that the Russian government finally admitted the truth. And then there's the Red Army's behavior in Berlin. As Soviet troops stormed the German capital in 1945, an estimated 100,000 women were raped, some repeatedly. Victims ranged from young girls to elderly women. It was systematic, brutal, and often carried out with impunity. To this day, many survivors' stories remain untold. Silence and shame took over where justice never arrived. In the United States, the land of the free, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps. Their crime? Their ancestry. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, allowing for the relocation of anyone deemed a security threat. But no evidence of espionage was ever found. There were no trials. No due process. Just a knock on the door, and everything was gone. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to pack what they could carry. They were sent to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Schools were built inside fences. Babies were born behind them. And people died there, too. These weren't prison camps for enemy soldiers. They were for ordinary citizens. Farmers. Shop owners. Children. America, the great democracy, violated its own constitution in the name of national security. In 1943, while Britain was fighting Nazi Germany, one of the worst famines in human history occurred in British-controlled India. An estimated 3 million people died in the Bengal famine. But this wasn't merely a natural disaster. It was, to a large extent, a man-made tragedy. British wartime policies, including the hoarding of grain and prioritization of resources for the war effort, led to severe food shortages in India. Yes, the Allies won the war. Yes, they defeated fascism. But we must confront the uncomfortable truth: victory does not erase wrongdoing. When history is written by the victors, it's easy to overlook the shadows in the spotlight. Allied atrocities were not rare incidents or rogue actions. They were policy-driven, systematic, and, in many cases, deliberate. Part of the answer lies in post-war narratives. The Nuremberg trials, held by the Allies, prosecuted Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity. But there was no similar tribunal for the Allied bombing of civilians. No trials for Soviet war crimes. No reckoning for internment camps or colonial starvation. Justice, it seems, was selective. Why this matters today? Some might say, it's in the past. Why dig it up now? But history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. When we ignore or downplay Allied atrocities, we set a dangerous precedent, that some crimes are acceptable if committed by the right people. That might makes right. We need to tell the whole truth. Not to diminish the suffering under fascism, but to understand the full cost of war. To honor all victims, regardless of which flag flew above them. Closing thoughts. World War II was a monumental conflict. It ended with the fall of fascism, the liberation of death camps, and the rise of a new world order. But along the way, the good war left behind a trail of destruction, some of it committed by those who claimed the moral high ground. We need to tell the whole truth. Not to diminish the suffering under fascism, but to understand the full cost of war. To honor all victims, regardless of which flag flew above them. Closing thoughts. World War II was a monumental conflict. It ended with the fall of fascism, the liberation of death camps, and the rise of a new world order. But along the way, the good war left behind a trail of destruction, some of it committed by those who claimed the moral high ground.